Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We are going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, LIBOR, and specifically why preparing for LIBOR cessation now is critical. You are joined by three folks from Vorys. I am Nikki Workman. I am a partner in the Columbus office, and I co-chair our finance practice. I'm joined by Kim Schaefer, who is a partner in our corporate group in the Cincinnati office, and by Zach Brumfield, who's an associate in the finance practice in our Columbus office as well. And we'll hear from them here in just a moment as we get into the presentation. You had a housekeeping slide as you joined. There is a Q&A feature. There is a widget on your screen. So if you have any questions during the program that you would like us to answer, please submit those through the Q&A function. If we run out of time or are not able to address your question, or if a question arises after, you are welcome to reach out to any of us following the webinar, and our contact information is there on the slide. Speaking of slides, our PDF of the slide deck is available on your screen as well. So if you'd like to download those and have them for reference, they are there for you. And again, our contact information is in there, and you're welcome to reach out to us at any point. Thank you for joining us. We want to be very mindful of everyone's time, so we will jump right in. Very briefly outlining scope, what we're talking about, what we're not talking about. We will spend a little bit of time talking about where we've been, and specifically on the current state of the ARRC and Isda recommendations on LIBOR contract fallback language, and a little bit of what's happening in the market on that front. We will spend some time talking about the late November announcements by the ICE Benchmark Association, which is the administrator of LIBOR, as well as the U.S. regulatory announcements and the status of that, what we expect to see, and then the coming weeks to get a little more certainty on that front. And then we will close with a roadmap of sorts on the kinds of things that banks should be thinking about right now as we look to 21 and LIBOR ceasing to be published in the near term. So what are we not covering, which I think is important to outline here? Caveat, this is not a LIBOR or SOFR 101 type webinar. We did a SOFR webinar last summer that if you're interested in that kind of content, reach out to us and we're happy to provide that to you. But this presentation presumes an understanding of LIBOR and how it functions, an understanding of SOFR and the various different structures that are being considered by the market. So if we're talking about something and daily compounded SOFR versus daily simple, and you don't know what we're talking about, again, feel free to reach out to any of us, but this presumes a baseline level of understanding. We're not going to talk about any tax or accounting considerations, SEC reporting. We will talk about, as I mentioned, some of the regulatory considerations, but for the most part, we're not going to get in the weeds on that as well. So certainly always recommend discussing these issues with your accountants, with your tax advisors, with your attorneys. And so let's begin. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with where we've been. Zach, turn it over to you. And
yes, hi everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. And my job is to kind of set the table here for our conversation, because at the beginning of 2020, the year was for everyone to focus on LIBOR. And as we all know, that was, derailed to a certain extent because of the COVID-19 pandemic and other PPP loan programs and other type of issues that were coming up with dealing with that. So what we really want to do is just set the table to everybody to refocus that although LIBOR did take a back seat, the governmental bodies and the other trade associations continued its work throughout the year to get us to where we are. So as everyone knows, after 2008, LIBOR was being manipulated because it is essentially a rate that is established by panel banks making submissions on what their cost of funds are. And because it's not based on actual transactions, it was subject to manipulation, which started a bunch of conversations in the United States and in the UK on is LIBOR really the appropriate risk-free reference rate to be used in a myriad of financial products. So a famous speech was given in July of 2017 by Andrew Bailey, the CEO of the FCA, which is the Financial Conduct Authority. Basically, in that speech, he provided that the panel banks would no longer be required to submit LIBOR quotes to the Intercontinental Exchange at the end of 2021. So what that did is that triggered the market to start moving in a fashion that they needed to start thinking that LIBOR cessation or permanent cessation was a reality, and that one of the things that would certainly need to be done is that all the legal documentation that was referencing LIBOR would need to be updated to have robust fallback language in the event that LIBOR was permanently discontinued. So prior to these FCA announcements in July of 2017, every loan document that you would read, well, I would say most loan documents would have a cessation or market disruption clause, which essentially addressed the possibility if LIBOR would become temporarily unavailable, if there was a glitch in technology or some screen rate was down, what would happen to the actual interest rate underneath your loan documentation so that you could have an actual rate that would accrue on your underlying loans. And most of the loan documentation had this, what we call a market disruption clause, but very few, and I would say none before 2017 had a mechanism in their loan documentation to address a permanent discontinuance of LIBOR. So after the 2017 speech by Andrew Bailey, the market itself started to put in LIBOR fallback language in the event that LIBOR would become permanently discontinued. And that was also started a real conversation in the Alternative Reference Rate Committee, which is a committee that was convened by the Federal Reserve Board and chaired by the New York Fed to get buy-side and sell-side participants to come together on what would exactly be the fallback robust language that would be needed that in the event that LIBOR would permanently be discontinued. And along with the Alternative Reference Rate Committee, which I'll call the ARRC, is how they're named, or the way that they're talked about in our world. There's also the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, where derivative transactions were also had in its Isda master agreement templates and a fallback mechanism if LIBOR was not permanently, but was temporarily unavailable, but they also needed to be addressed. So both of these remediation measures to make language in their legal documentation to be available in the event that LIBOR were to go away completely were started in the initiatives, were started right around the 2017 speech that Andrew Bailey came out with. So after conversations and issuances of different public comment and conversations within the ARRC, in 2019, let me back up. After the 2017 speech, there was market language that was out that was being adopted, but not formally recognized by ARRC, and the market kind of took it on itself to say what would the language look like if LIBOR was permanently discontinued. But in 2019, that changed because ARRC actually issued for many different financial products the fallback language that would need to be used if LIBOR was permanently discontinued. And they actually provided recommendations in both the bilateral loan market, where it's just a single borrower and a single lender, and also in the syndicated space, where what would the language look like with LIBOR to be permanently discontinued. And in those 2019 recommendations by the ARRC, there was three different approaches that were provided. There was the amendment approach, which is essentially an agreement today that you would agree later on what the benchmark replacement would be in the event that a LIBOR triggering cessation event would occur. The hardwired approach, which would be agreement today that a specific rate would be inserted in your loan documentation, which would be based on the ARRC recommendation, the secured overnight financing rate, SOFR. And then there was a third recommendation, which was the head loan approach, but that was only issued for the bilateral loans, which would basically provide you a mechanism to have a perfect hedge between your cash product of your loan and your derivative in the event that LIBOR were to cease. And the hardwired approach, and this is something that we're going to focus on because of subsequent recommendations by the ARRC, which we'll touch on, is that they basically gave a waterfall approach where at first, when LIBOR had ceased to exist, it would drop to term SOFR, but if term SOFR was not available, it would actually go down to a methodology to determine SOFR called the daily compounded SOFR. And then finally, if a daily compounded SOFR rate was not available, it would fall to the amendment approach. But then over the summer in June of 2020, all these recommendations for the bilateral and syndicated space were updated, where they did not provide any further recommendations for the amendment approach, but they provided an updated hardwired approach for syndications and an updated hardwired and hedged loan approach for bilateral loans. And one of the main differences in that hardwire, or the June 2020 issuance by the ARRC, was that instead of a daily compounded SOFR rate, they were actually made a daily simple SOFR as the second prong in the waterfall, because it was much more of an easy methodology for cash loans to be calculated, and it wasn't as complex as the compounded SOFR rate that was being offered by Isda, but we'll get to that. So one of the variations of the ARRC language that we've seen since the June 2020 hardwired recommendation is that term SOFR is not yet available as a forward-looking rate based on the secured overnight financing rate. But what we've seen is market participants who are wanting to insert a hardwired approach is that they say in the event that there's a cessation event, which is a public announcement that LIBOR is ceased or is no longer representative, is that it will fall to term SOFR, but if no term SOFR rate is available, it would drop down to daily simple SOFR. But in the event that term SOFR were to become available and administratively feasible for either the agent or the loan, is that it would actually kick back up to a term SOFR rate. And that's because borrowers want to have certainty and have a forward-looking rate to be able to determine what their interest rate liability is prior to the current period, where daily simple SOFR, actually you have to calculate your interest rate liability of the current period. And then we've seen also a different approach taken where when you have a swap in place, because of the disconnect between Isda, which we'll get to, and the ARRC, that they'll actually take more of a hedge loan approach. So that was June 2020 when this came out, and what we've seen just in the last part of 2020. But in the last part of 2020 and the early 2021, we've seen regional banks become more and more comfortable with the hardwired approach, where they're actually inserting SOFR as the rate. But the smaller bank rollout is a little more complicated. One, because there's not very many publicly available deals. And two, there also is just more of a, I think, question on is SOFR the appropriate rate for some of these banks that are smaller or mid-market sized banks. So I've already mentioned that there's been a bit of a disconnect with Isda and the ARRC, and in 2020 probably can be named as like the Isda protocol year, because that's really where the focus was, is that everything was on hold until Isda provided its mechanism to put in more robust fallback language for LIBOR. And they're doing this in two ways. The first, what they're doing is they are amending the 2006 definitions, which are incorporated by reference into every Isda master agreement. And they issued that on October 23rd of 2020. And what that does is that on January 25th, 2021, in just a few weeks' time, every new Isda will have reference or have fallback language incorporated into these amendments or definitions, so that the the LIBOR rate will have robust fallback language automatically for every trade that's entered after January 25th, 2021. But to remediate all of the legacy ISDA documentation, there's actually the ISDA IBOR fallbacks protocol, which went live again October 23rd, 2020, and parties would have to adhere to incorporate these new 2006 definitions into their ISDA document, their legacy ISDA documentation. And this was a huge lift, and most global money center banks and large banks are requiring or are really championing the protocol and the adherence to it. But there are some different deviations on how the cash product, how the ARRC is moving forward in cash products, and how ISDA has determined what the fallback rate is for its derivative products. So, again, most banks have are asking its counterparties and itself have adhered to the protocol, but we haven't seen many end users or corporates adhere just because of this hedge loan issue, where the ARRC hardwired approach is now being adopted or recommended that you fall back to a daily simple SOFR rate. The ISDA amendment and the protocol actually have championed or put in its protocol documentation that the actual SOFR rate be compounded in arrears. So this could create what we call a basis risk in between a loan that has the ARRC recommended language and a derivative that is either incorporated by reference to 2006 definitions or is adhered to the protocol to incorporate the 2006 definitions. So what we've seen is that there hasn't been a full lockstep of making those match, but this issue remains in flux, and I know that there's certain ways around this that we can discuss more fully going forward, but we just wanted to bring to your attention that there is a disconnect from pure cash products and derivative products on how they are going to insert a new risk-free reference rate, which is SOFR, when LIBOR has ceased.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And to close the loop on that before we move on to the announcement, I mean, we've been involved in a number of conversations in the last week with both bank clients as well as our corporate clients on this hedge loan issue. And there have been conversations about, should the bank agree to have the swap fall back to daily simple, in which case the borrower is happy because the loan and the hedge match. But in that case, most likely the bank's back-to-back hedge is based on compounded SOFR, so the bank is going to take some basis risk. And from what we understand, some banks are likely getting comfortable with that idea right now, from what we understand, being lawyers and not actual finance technicians, is that the difference between daily simple SOFR and compounded SOFR in arrears right now is very small in the current rates environment. And so I think some people feel that, and in fact, ISDA has said this on calls that we've participated in, that they recognize that the ISDA protocol solution isn't perfect, but as a mechanism to amend hundreds or thousands of documents at one time, it gets you in a much better position than you would be if you didn't. And basically, not saying ignore the basis risk, but it's a balancing of outcomes here or priorities. And is the priority to get everything done perfectly, or is it to get us moving forward? And it seems like, some value judgments have been made there. So more to come on that topic. I wish we had something more definitive for you. I actually had a discussion with one of our corporate clients on Monday evening, and I think they were hoping for a definitive answer. And I spent 30 minutes just telling them the state of the market, which is helpful in the sense that there has been no coalescence, as Zach mentioned, on a solution. And we've actually seen, in guidance coming out from bank clients and discussions we've had, that banks really, there are lots of different options being discussed. So a very interesting issue that we'll continue to watch. Pivoting to late November. So I'm sure many of you, like us, were a little surprised on the Monday after Thanksgiving when we were all drinking our coffee and trying to get back into work after a couple days at home for Thanksgiving. And a flurry of announcements came out, and we all were trying to figure out what was going on. And what's interesting is from subsequent calls that we participated in with LSTA and Isda and others, I don't think they even knew necessarily that these were coming. It really seemed to take the market by surprise. As Zach mentioned, I think in 2020, once COVID really became a reality, a lot of folks felt like, or at least wishful thinking, that LIBOR cessation would get kicked out because we had even more emergent issues to deal with COVID. But consistently, the regulators and the industry groups said, no, we recognize the hardships, but LIBOR, we must continue doing this work. So I think that's why the market was a bit surprised by this announcement. There were a couple of announcements that came out on the same day. The first, ICE Benchmark Association, which is the administrator of LIBOR, put out an announcement that they were issuing a consultation. And so what does that mean? It's not a final rule or a final proclamation yet. A consultation is an idea they're proposing to the market, and they've asked for feedback. So we are currently in this consultation period, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the announcement was of this consultation. And what are they consulting on? They are consulting specifically on, at least this announcement. There were other announcements relating to other LIBORs, but talking specifically about US dollar LIBOR. And what they are proposing is ceasing to publish 1 week and 2 month US dollar LIBOR at the end of 2021 as originally planned. But for other versions of LIBOR, very commonly used 1 month, 3 month, 6 month LIBOR, continuing to publish that as a rate until June of 2023. And so Kim will talk in a minute about the details of the regulators' announcements, but on the same day, the primary U.S. regulators, so the FDIC, the OCC, and the Fed, in a joint statement, also issued further guidance in this respect. There's a quote on this slide here from the chairman of the ARRC, and it is a board member, I think, to help drive home the gravity of these announcements. These are some of the most consequential announcements on LIBOR in many years. So this is a big deal. And I think in a lot of ways, it was very welcome by the market to give additional time to remedy those legacy contracts, which again, we'll talk about here shortly. But here, again, I got a little ahead of myself here on the slide, but what the IBA announced, and there's a link here, these within the PDF, there are some hyperlinks that can take you directly to the announcement in the event that's helpful for you. And in terms of timing, as I mentioned, the consultation period opened on December 4th, which was about a week after that announcement, and it closes on January 25th, which is in just a few weeks' time here. We don't have any real clarity on what happens after January 25th. A number of folks in the market have indicated that certainly the intent is to move as quickly as they can. I think the market's expecting clarity or finality on this. I've even heard before the end of January. Well, I suppose it depends on what the consultation produces and the kinds of comments that they're receiving. But we don't expect that it's going to be a number of months before we have final guidance. But until we have that, we cannot act with certainty that we're going to have this additional amount of time to remediate legacy contracts. So again, to put a finer point on this, when we're thinking about these issues, we're thinking about drawing a line between contracts, from a certain date forward and looking back. When we're talking about legacy contracts, we're talking about, all right, contracts that were based on LIBOR prior to these relevant dates. And what this essentially does is create a divide for if this consultation were to move forward, and we'll talk about what this roadmap looks like shortly, but banks would still need to be prepared, and this is, I think, a big takeaway, to cease issuing new LIBOR contracts before the end of the year, this year, 2021. So that means no new LIBOR loans, no new LIBOR derivatives with very limited exception that aren't really relevant to this discussion before the end of 21, yet anything that's entered into prior to the end of 21 would have that additional time through June of 2023 to either build back in the robust fallback language or amend the agreement to, instead of having fallback, to, at some point, move the rate from a LIBOR-based rate to SOFR or something else. Or it's possible, you may have legacy contracts that terminate prior to June 2023. So part of this exercise is, and the justification that was discussed when this announcement was made, is that when they looked at the market, and I think that was part of the logic in choosing June 23, there were a significant number of existing LIBOR contracts, loans, derivatives, et cetera, that would expire or terminate prior to June 2023. So, for LIBOR loans that are otherwise performing and that terminate, say, in September of 2022, that loan could continue based on LIBOR. LIBOR will continue to be published, and that loan can run its course. So what they were trying to do was give banks sufficient time to remediate all those legacy contracts or allow them to roll off, while also to keeping their feet to the fire for transitioning away from LIBOR for new issuances. Kim, why don't you talk specifically about the regulatory piece of this?
Yeah. So what we have found is that on the same day that the IBA's announcement came out, the three, as Nikki mentioned, the three, large federal banking agencies, the Fed, the OCC, and the FDIC, also issued a joint statement on LIBOR. Now, one thing that I do want to address, and Nikki and Zach both talked about this, is that you may recall that earlier in November, those three agencies had also issued on November 6th a joint statement that reiterated, hey, we're not endorsing any specific replacement rate for LIBOR. SOFR has become very wildly popular, and a lot of our clients that we're working with to meet these deadlines have asked us, is it really SOFR? Is it something else? But the agencies have issued, the banking regulatory agencies have said, banks have to look at what's best for them. They have varied funding models and various customer needs, and each bank needs to consider its specific circumstances when it's structuring its lending activities and determining what is a suitable replacement for LIBOR. So I just want to piggyback on something Nikki and Zach said earlier, in that, I know everyone's still considering that, and we get a lot of questions about that. But that was earlier guidance that was issued. So on the day later in November that IBA issued their announcement, this joint statement came out, and it encouraged banks to cease using LIBOR as soon as practicable, but absolutely no later than December 31st, 2021. And the agency said, look, as we come in to examine you, we're going to be looking at this now. So you need to start preparing for disruptions in the U.S. LIBOR rate, including, operating with sufficient fallback language, which they've been talking about. And if you fail to do that, it can undermine the financial stability of the bank and your safety and soundness. And as we all know, the regulators love to use safety and soundness as, and sometimes rightfully so, the catch-all. So if there isn't a specific regulation regarding something, safety and soundness becomes their backup for, we don't like what you're doing, we don't like what we're seeing in an exam, and it's a safety and soundness issue. So when they use that language repeatedly in this joint announcement, it obviously perked up everyone's ears, including, I'm sure, many of yours. We have on this slide some of the specific quotes that were included in that joint statement. It said, the agencies believe that if you enter into a new contract using LIBOR as a reference rate after the end of this year, it will create a safety and soundness risk, and we're going to examine for it. And any new contracts that are entered into before the end of this year should either utilize a reference rate other than LIBOR or include that robust fallback language that clearly defines an alternative reference rate for after LIBOR ceases. And they're saying that doing these things facilitate your orderly and safety and soundness transition from LIBOR. One of the other things, though, to keep in mind is that there was also included in that joint statement some exceptions. So, because of what was issued, there's the potential, again, that some of the LIBOR rates will be used until June of 23. So it said that if that administrator extends the publication of U.S. LIBOR beyond the end of this year, the federal banking agencies recognize that there may be some limited circumstances in which it's still appropriate for banks to use U.S. dollar LIBOR after the end of this year. And those are limited circumstances, though. So the four exceptions are listed here. It includes, transactions that are executed for purposes of required participation in a counterparty auction procedure. market making in support of client activity that's related to US dollar LIBOR transactions that were executed before January 1st of 2022, transactions that reduce or hedge a bank's or any client of the bank's LIBOR exposure on contracts, and novations of US dollar LIBOR transactions that are executed before January 1st of 2022. So they do recognize that there may be some appropriate exceptions, but again, as a safety and soundness issue, the federal banking agencies have been very abundantly clear that, we expect you're going to cease using LIBOR as soon as possible, and certainly no longer after the end of this year.
Now, Kim, to clarify this a little bit, you mentioned the November 6th statement, and that was more about, from what I understand, whether or not SOFR was the only alternative reference rate. And they said, okay, it could be a Maribor, the bank has to make the choice, but it doesn't have to be SOFR. But prior to this November 30th announcement, I don't think we'd seen regulators really digging in very deep. I think we've heard, I'm thinking two banks in particular, where one bank said, and I forget which, it might be the OCC as their regulator, they basically said, hey, do you have a LIBOR transition plan? And the bank did, and they showed the regulator, and that was it. Right. And there's another example I heard from another bank client where, and I think in this case, the regulator was the Fed, they were much more in their back pocket, and they actually wanted to see the documentation inventory they'd done on their LIBOR contract remediation process. So I think this is the first we've seen a real unified announcement of, we will be examining for this, and you need to be prepared to stop making LIBOR loans at the end of 21.
Yeah, and so and that's a great point, Nikki. Just to be clear, I mean, although it sounds like you see this December 31st, 2021 deadline in this joint statement, they are going to be examining for it before the end of this year. They're looking at it now. As Nikki mentioned, we have clients that, and it depends on the regulator, and it depends on which examiner comes into your bank. But we have clients that are now being asked for, just do you have a transition plan? Or we want to see detail. And again, it wraps up into that safety and soundness concern, which they use as that catch-all for, here's something we don't like. And it's hard to predict what they don't like, but just know that they are focusing on it now in exams that you have scheduled this year. And it would be much better to be prepared and have a really good answer. And that's why we've been working with so many clients now on getting ready and what are you going to do? And again, based on that November 6th guidance, it's not that they want to see SOFR, but they want to see a plan. They want to know that you're thinking ahead. You've assessed what your risk is. You've assessed maybe how many contracts this affects, and the whole universe of how the bank has to look at this from very different perspectives and be able to present that to your examiners.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue, Kim, into, all right, so they're going to be asking. And so you're probably thinking, all right, well, what the heck should we be doing? So that's where we're heading next. And I know from our attendee list, we have folks from varying sizes of banks. And for some of your institutions, the more larger ones, they've had, starting with, the example that we'll get to in a moment, but forming an internal working group of a cross-disciplinary working group of folks from risk and from operations and from legal and from the line of business and others. Some banks have had those in place for years, and others I know are just starting the process. So this is meant for everyone. I think there'll be stuff here that everybody will find helpful. But again, when that regulator comes in, and this is beyond just being able to pass a regulatory exam, what should you be doing as you think about how do I navigate through 21 and beyond? In terms of some certain key milestones, we've hit on some of these as we've gone along, but I think it's helpful to think about them collectively as a group of milestones. The first being, as soon as possible, all new LIBOR loans should include robust fallback language. So there's an asterisk by this one because if you're going on the ARRC recommendation, ARRC actually has, and it's all available online, a recommended PACE transition plan. If you're following that and you haven't adopted robust LIBOR fallback language yet, you're behind on ARRC's timetable. Their recommendations for that were to have that rolled out by September, October of 2020. So no panic if you haven't. We're only a few months off of that date. And certainly for smaller institutions, it'd be easier to implement than some of the larger institutions. But certainly that should be done top of the priority list. Another one of those as soon as possible, again, recommended by the ARRC to have been completed in the fourth quarter of last year. Third-party technology and operations vendors should complete necessary enhancements to support SOFR or other alternate reference rates. So, I mean, that in and of itself implies engaging with third-party technology and operations vendors. You know, when we started, we were talking about the ARRC and the Isda contract language, and the legal side of this is important. But I think the operational side of this perhaps is even more important, or a larger driver, because you can put whatever you want in the legal documentation. We can draft a loan agreement that says it's going to be daily simple SOFR. But if your loan systems aren't equipped or haven't been augmented in a way that are necessary to be able to calculate interest at the rate your loan document says you're going to, if you're falling back to, you don't want to put a hardwire fallback in your loan agreement until you're certain that your loan systems can actually calculate interest in that way. So that's another really critical item that, again, should be at the very top of the list in terms of timing. As we've mentioned, all banks should be prepared to cease making new loans based on LIBOR and entering into new derivatives based on LIBOR, subject to those very limited exceptions, by December 31st, 2021. As Kim mentioned, and I think it's worth emphasizing, that doesn't mean you can wait until December 31st to flip the switch. I think if you wait, it's going to be too late at that point. So both from a regulatory perspective, being able to respond effectively to your regulators' questions, but also this is not something that just happens overnight. ARRC's actual recommendation is that banks plan to cease making new LIBOR loans by June 30th of 2021. So by the summertime, you know, certainly you aim for the summer, there's probably going to be some delay there, but giving yourself enough cushion that you're not scrambling in December when you know the deadline is very real at that point.
And Nikki, one thing that I wanted to add as well is we've talked about the regulators coming in and making these examinations, but also just from an institutional perspective, that even though we weren't going to get into the real details of LIBOR against SOFR, the paradigm is now shifting from a cost plus model of LIBOR, where your loans are based on your cost of funds that were based on a term rate like LIBOR that embedded certain credit risk, and now SOFR is a historical rate that is based on actual overnight transactions, where not only are you doing this from for regulatory purposes, but institutionally, you have to kind of look at the modeling on what exactly it's going to do to your bottom line, or how you're going to accrue interest on your loans using a rate that is so different from what LIBOR is based upon. And I know a lot of our clients have done that kind of root cause analysis type of modeling of what exactly do my assets and liabilities look like by using this new risk-free reference rate. And that too is a part of this whole process most banks have done, and have kind of vetted what exactly does my model look like using a new risk-free reference rate that does not have that cost plus model.
Well, that's a great point, Zach. And, you know, as you mentioned, it's not just a matter of deciding what the replacement rates, well, SOFR sounds great, or that's what the market's doing. There's a lot of internal analysis that needs to be done to make that final determination. So that's a great point. To reiterate this briefly, and then we'll move on to some other, to more of a roadmap, other things to be thinking about. If the consultation closes and is successful, and I use success in the sense that we get the additional time to remediate, June 30th, 2023 becomes another key milestone. That's the date by which any legacy LIBOR contracts must be remediated. So again, either amended to include the robust fallback language, or amended to replace LIBOR with SOFR or another replacement rate, or to roll off or to terminate in accordance with the terms. So underpinning that, though, is being able to understand, all right, what contracts do we have now? What are their maturity dates? We'll talk about that process in just a moment. But to further emphasize the point, if the consultation is not successful, then there is no additional time to remediate. So it seems unlikely based on the guidance we've heard and what industry groups are speculating. I mean, we heard on an LSTA call that their perspective was this was all done in concert and it was very orchestrated, and they wouldn't have taken this step if they didn't expect the consultation to be successful. So that's certainly not a guarantee of result, but I think the market is definitely expecting that we're going to get this additional time, but stay tuned. All right, so in terms of, we'll close out here with some best practices. So we've talked about what got us here, what the regulators are going to be asking you, some key milestones you should keep in mind. What should you be doing? There we go. All right. So I mentioned this just a moment ago. And again, many of you on the call, your institutions probably have already done this, but to the extent you haven't, this is the place to start. Forming an internal working group to develop a LIBOR transition plan with specific goals and key milestones. So conducting a comprehensive impact assessment, developing a roadmap, confirming resource and budget needs, and establishing a project management framework are all critical parts of that. As I mentioned, I mean, this should be a cross-disciplinary group with folks from legal, from operations, from risk, from marketing and communications, from the line of business, from accounting, from tax. I mean, this really touches every part of the bank, and there should be appropriate personnel in these meetings to work through the process. So that's recommendation number one. Recommendation number two, create a LIBOR contract inventory and make a plan to remediate all affected contracts by, again, that relevant date, whether it's June 30th of 23 or December 31st of 2021. So what do we mean by this? And this is actually quite a heavy lift, and this is part, again, I know of one client in particular where the regulator was asking about their documentation inventory and where they were in the process, and the regulator wasn't happy because they didn't think they were far enough along. So this is truly how many LIBOR contracts, so put derivatives aside, let's just, for sake of example, use loans. How many customer loans do you have that are based on LIBOR? And let's say the answer is 1,000. And of those 1,000 LIBOR loans, having an inventory that says, all right, how many of those mature after June 2023? And let's say there are 550. So, being able to identify those, this is the group that we need to remediate. And of those 550 loans, what does the contract already say about LIBOR? As Zach mentioned, some loan agreements already had LIBOR fallback language. If it's more of the laser pro variety, I mean, sometimes the documents are so bank friendly, they may say in the event the rate's unavailable, the lender may designate a replacement rate. So it's looking at the actual contract language and saying, all right, does this have robust fallback language or not? Does the bank have the ability to implement a replacement rate, or is there a process by which the rate will be selected? If not, then that document gets flagged and it needs to be remediated either, in the next renewal that comes up, or there needs to be a plan. But as a starting place, being able to understand as an institution, how many LIBOR contracts do we have, dividing them into categories of which have sufficient fallback language, which have no fallback language, or again, which mature prior to June 23, in which case, at least right now, it looks like those may be able to just run their course. So that's step number two. Step number three, again, some of you have already done this, but developing robust fallback language to include in any new LIBOR contracts entered into in 21. And so this is, as Zach mentioned, I mean, the ARRC has become market standard, and we're seeing that all the time in the market. Certainly as you get further down market, banks have, in some cases, taken the ARRC language and simplified it because it's probably adds 3 or 4 pages of detail. So if it's already a pretty streamlined loan agreement, it could be disproportionate in that respect, or it may not need the level of detail that ARRC has provided for larger deals. But certainly having robust fallback language that goes into any new LIBOR contract basically entered into from now until forever, that should be a priority as well. Some other things to think about. If the bank has adopted the ARRC amendment approach, consider moving to Hardwire. And there, we've talked to some of our bank clients about this as well. I mean, if it's the ARRC amendment approach, the version that gives the bank the most discretion, that says in the event a triggering event occurs, and as Zach mentioned, that's a publication of a statement that LIBOR is no longer representative or will cease as of a certain date, that the lender may replace the rate. And that gives the bank a lot of discretion. Conceivably, then there's no negotiation with the borrower. The bank's going to implement a process by which it provides notice to the customers under those relevant loan agreements that as of XYZ date, your LIBOR rate is hereby replaced by daily simple SOFR. Here are the conforming changes, which is part of the ARRC language. So not only are you designating here's the replacement rate and the spread adjustment, but also if you need to change the interest payment dates or the definition of interest period or other kinds of administrative or operational things, you can do so by notice. But there have been a lot of banks, and this is rightfully so. I mean, borrowers have negotiated in either consultation rights or even outright rights to agree on an amendment. So if you have the ARRC amendment approach and you've agreed with the borrower that they have a consultation right or a right to agree to amend, consider moving those to Hardwire if the bank's prepared to move to SOFR. Why is that? If you're trying to reach agreement or amend hundreds or thousands of LIBOR contracts on the same day, this big bang, when LIBOR ceases, it seems almost impossible. So a lot of banks have started to think about, all right, moving those amendment approaches away from the amendment approach to the Hardwire. And what the Hardwire said, as Zach mentioned, is when LIBOR, the triggering event occurs, here's the specific waterfall. And so again, you're not negotiating with the customer. What you're going to do is just send a notice to all affected customers as of this certain date. The triggering event has occurred pursuant to the waterfall. Your new rate is daily simple SOFR. Here's the conforming changes, rather than a whole negotiation.
And just to add to that, one of the important items, especially on the sell side, or when we say sell side, on the bank side, is just having your sales folks or your relationship managers that are going out to your customers and clients equipped with the ability to actually discuss, a sacred right to a borrower's loan, which is their interest rate and how that is changing, and making sure that they're totally informed of what's actually happening to their underlying interest rate liability and the reasoning why all of this is lockstep from the bank's institutional perspective on working with them, because we've seen borrowers, especially kind of upmarket, they know these issues, but as you continue to go with your whole portfolio of loans, not everyone might be tracking, as Nikki, Kim, and I, and a lot of the folks on this call, exactly what's happening with the ARRC or Isda. I mean, these are just these are just acronyms. They have no idea of what's happening. So communication with them on the front lines goes a long way to remediate and to meet these regulatory and practical and institutional steps in this process.
Yep. Thank you, Zach. So again, that's item 4. Something else that you should be considering at this point is, and Zach mentioned this earlier, identifying the rate or rates that the bank will use to replace LIBOR. Again, what we're seeing most commonly in the market are variations of SOFR. The one that and I don't want to put this on the same level of SOFR, because I think we've talked to 2 banks maybe who are considering a Maribor, but that's the only other one that we've really heard as an alternative reference rate to LIBOR. And we actually had a question from the audience about this. Will the new reference rate be uniformly the same or specific to each institution? So this is where each institution needs to decide for themselves. And this is what Ken mentioned earlier about the regulators. The regulators are not saying you must use SOFR. The regulators are saying that you need to identify something that isn't LIBOR, and you need to do that work and evaluate, all right, is SOFR the right rate for the bank? Is a Maribor the right rate for the bank? Or is it some other rate? And I also want to be clear, it doesn't have to be just one. We're actually working with one of our bank clients right now on developing form documentation, which is what we're talking about here in this bullet point, to allow documentation for either Ameribor-based loans or SOFR-based loans. And I think they're just not certain the way the market's going to go. I mean, of course, when we think about the rate, it's not only the operational side, what can the bank support or what can the loan system handle in terms of calculating interest, but I also think there's going to be this really interesting time period in this transition phase where borrowers may be getting multiple term sheets for a deal, and they're going to get 2 LIBOR term sheets and they're going to get 2 SOFR term sheets. And how do the borrowers navigate that and decide, all right, if I've got 4 LIBOR term sheets, I can say, all right, which spread is the lowest, but looking at these different options. So, it's possible, you may want to consider having multiple rate options in the event from a sales perspective that it makes sense. But once you identify those rates, and again, from an operations perspective, do our systems support calculation of interest in this way, you're going to start making loans based on that new rate. And none of your loan documentation today, Laser Pro, internal bank form, or whatnot, are built to support this rate other than LIBOR. So doing that work internally to update all bank forms. So, I mean, some banks have a really nice suite of internal documents, and, they're kept in, an online site that all the outside counsel references. So it's a matter of making sure all those form documents are updated to include appropriate new defined terms and mechanisms for the new alternative reference rate. A lot of banks are also issuing outside counsel guidance. So some banks that don't have forms, or at least maybe they have forms, but they're not required, allow their outside counsel to use their own forms. And in that case, you're going to need very specific guidance to all of your outside counsel on, all right, here's our replacement rate, here's how you draft the definition, here's how interest period needs to be defined, and a whole host of other things. So again, that's a big communication lift that, the first step that needs to happen is decide what rate is relevant. And then there's a lot of work to do that follows to make sure the loan documents can actually implement whatever this replacement rate is going to be. All right. A couple other things to consider are, and we've talked a little bit about the customer side of this, I just mentioned, working with your marketing communications team. If you have internal education teams, I mean, I think it's twofold. It is customer communication education. As Zach mentioned this earlier, having the relationship managers and the salespeople equipped to have these discussions with customers who, receive some kind of notice from the bank about this topic, or maybe they receive a request from the bank to adhere to the Isda protocol because they have a swap that's tied to the loan, and they want to know what this means. So having folks that are educated and equipped to have these discussions, we think is critical from a relationship perspective. And so it's not just the folks on the LIBOR transition team at the bank that need to understand this, but certainly anyone who's client facing. And then also, the internal communication piece of that, and making sure the relevant folks at the bank have the information they need about the bank's process, and where they are. Again, my guess is they're going to be getting lots of questions from borrowers, and being able to effectively address those, I think is critical. And then, one thing that's a little different than what we've been talking about, which is the customer side of this, but the bank's own lines of credit. Kim and I were on a call a couple weeks ago with a bank client, and they have 2 different lines of credit, and they have some trust securities outstanding, all of which are priced based on LIBOR, and none of which have any fallback mechanisms. So for the bank's own products, whether it's lines of credit or certainly the bank's derivatives, I mean, I think the Isda solution, you will see banks using that primarily on the derivative side, but for the bank's lines of credit, it's not just an issue for the bank as the borrower, but certainly their lender as well. But want to keep that in mind as we go. So we've covered a lot here in 54 minutes. Again, this was intended to be a current snapshot of the market, what we're seeing now, and what you should be thinking about, over the next 12 months as we head towards this next milestone, which is no new LIBOR loans before the end of December 31st, 2021. Again, you have the slides for reference. Our contact information is there. I don't see any more questions. but we'll give folks, if you have any questions now, we have a few minutes left. If not, feel free to reach out. Kim, Zach, any other thoughts from you before we go?
No, I did want to address one question, Nikki. One of the things that we hear a lot from clients is just because since 2017 and LIBOR has been determined that it will be discontinued, a lot of folks ask us, especially in the loan market, should we be kind of the first movers in this space? Or it seems like there's a chicken and the egg problem where some people are waiting for the loan industry, kind of the big hitters to come out with how they're going to originate loans based on a rate other than LIBOR, or should we, kind of tackle this, 800-pound gorilla ourselves, and how that question is impacted just by the regulatory piece of this, where the examiners will be coming, and I think that's a good discussion point, just because we have heard that question.
I think that's right. We've heard a lot from people. We don't want to be first, but we don't want to be last. So I think there's a lot of everybody waiting and looking at each other and thinking, well, I don't want to be the first mover. But then when one person moves, you see a bunch of people falling in line. So I think that's where having that internal working group really cohesive and ready to go, and being able to react to what's coming can be really important. But certainly, I mean, I think everyone expects the global money centers to be moving first, and then it falls down the market. But at some point, it's we've got this very hard deadline out there, so definitely need to be making progress towards that as a goal, even if you're not ready to implement or to offer loans based on SOFR yet. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This was recorded, and we will be sending out this recording so you can come back to it for reference. If there's anyone within your institutions who you think could benefit from this, feel free. This is not only available to folks who attended, so feel free to share it within your institutions, and we are here to help, and good luck.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yes.